Today, we will be looking at 14 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. Each story starts with confidence, but ends in chaos. One wrong turn, one mistake, one moment underground, and everything turns into unimaginable terror. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On Thanksgiving weekend, 1981, 16 people entered Trapoor Cave in Indiana for what should have been a routine caving expedition. Trapoor Cave sits in the Garson Chapel Valley area near Bloomington in Monroe County, Indiana. It's not some massive tourist attraction or well-known cave system. It's the kind of place where serious spelunkers go to explore tight passages and challenging terrain. The cave gets its name from the narrow, restrictive entrance that acts like a trapdoor into the underground world below. This particular Thanksgiving weekend, a group of 16 adult cave explorers had organized an expedition into the cave system. It was a mixed group. 10 of them had previous caving experience and knew what they were doing, while 4 were members of the Michigan Interlakes Grotto, an organized caving club. The remaining 2 were complete novices who were getting their first real taste of serious underground exploration. On Saturday morning, the group entered Trapoor Cave with all their equipment: headlamps, ropes, extra batteries, and enough gear for what they expected to be a thorough but routine exploration of the cave system. They spent about 2 hours underground, moving through the various passages and chambers, exploring areas that some of them had never seen before. Everything went perfectly during their exploration. The cave was in good condition, the weather above ground was stable, and the group was working well together despite having varying levels of experience. They took their time, enjoyed the underground formations, and conducted a thorough survey of several passages they wanted to document. But here's the thing about caves. They're dynamic environments that can change without warning. Rock formations that have been stable for decades can suddenly shift due to water flow, temperature changes, or just the natural settling of geological formations. And sometimes that shift happens at exactly the wrong moment. As the group began their exit from Trapoor Cave, they were moving through the entrance passage in single file, the only way to navigate the narrow, restrictive opening that gives the cave its name. 2 members of the group had already cleared the entrance completely and were safely outside the cave. Glenn Anders, one of the experienced ones, was almost to the stand-up offset pit near the entrance when one of the worst disasters struck. Without any warning, no creaking, no rumbling, no indication that anything was wrong, the wall of the stream gully at the entrance completely collapsed. It was a sudden cave-in with no warning. The collapse was catastrophic and instantaneous. 3 massive rocks, each weighing between 1,400 pounds, 635 kilograms, broke free from the cave wall and came crashing down directly on top of Glenn Anders. One of the huge stones slammed into his left shoulder with crushing force, while the other 2 rocks pinned his hard hat, trapping his head and upper body in a position that made breathing extremely difficult. In the split second that the rocks came down, Anders instinctively drew his legs up toward his chest, a natural defensive reaction that probably saved his life at the time and gave him a chance to survive for some more time. The diagonal angle prevented his body from getting crushed and taking the full brutal force, however. It also put him in an incredibly compromised position. With his legs drawn up and his torso pinned under massive rocks, he could barely expand his chest to breathe. Every breath was a struggle, and the weight pressing down on him was slowly crushing his body. The sound of the collapse was absolutely terrifying. The 14 others who were still behind Anders in the entrance passage suddenly found themselves trapped in complete darkness as dust and debris filled the air. The narrow passage that had been their only way out was now blocked by tons of rock, and they had no idea if their friend Glenn was dead or alive on the other side. Don Maxwell, who was just behind Anders in line, immediately realized the gravity of the situation. He could hear Anders struggling to breathe just a few feet away, but the collapsed rocks made it impossible to see what was happening, or how badly he was injured. Maxwell tried to help Anders extend his legs to relieve some of the pressure on his chest and make breathing easier, but there was very little room to maneuver in the debris-filled passage. Meanwhile, outside the cave, A fourth-year medical student happened to be at the cave entrance with another caving party that was about to enter when the collapse occurred. The medical student immediately understood that this was a life-threatening emergency. Without hesitation, he squeezed through whatever gaps existed in the collapsed entrance and made his way to where Anders was trapped. Working in almost complete darkness with limited space to maneuver, he loosened Anders' chin strap to help him breathe and conducted a quick medical examination to assess his injuries. Anders was conscious and responsive, which meant he hadn't suffered a catastrophic head injury. But the medical student could feel a depressed area on Anders' shoulder where one of the massive rocks had impacted, indicating possible fractures or internal injuries. More immediately concerning was Anders' compromised breathing. The weight and positioning of the rocks made it extremely difficult for him to expand his chest properly. The medical student's assessment revealed that while the collapse area seemed to have stabilized, meaning no more rocks were likely to fall immediately, Glenn Anders was effectively pinned under tons of stone with no way to free himself. He was trapped in a position that made breathing difficult, potentially suffering from internal injuries, and completely dependent on outside help for survival. While the medical student was working to assess and stabilize Anders, the two party members who had successfully exited the cave before the collapse realized they needed to get help immediately. They ran to a nearby house belonging to someone named Blens and called for emergency rescue services. But they knew that conventional rescue equipment might not be sufficient to move rocks weighing over 1,400 pounds, 635 kilograms each. Inside the cave, the 14 trapped spelunkers behind the collapse had retreated from the blocked entrance crawl and made their way to an upper-level room where they could regroup and assess their situation. The psychological impact of being sealed underground was enormous. They were sealed inside the cave with no obvious way out, limited lighting, and no idea how long they might be stuck underground. The entrance collapse had created a situation where rescue from the outside would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, without heavy equipment. Back at the collapse site, additional rescue personnel began arriving and setting up a block and tackle system, a mechanical advantage system using pulleys and ropes that would allow them to move extremely heavy objects with human power. The rescue team's first priority was removing the smallest of the three rocks that were pinning Anders, hoping that would provide enough relief to improve his breathing and possibly allow him to be extracted. The block and tackle operation was painstakingly slow and dangerous. The rescuers had to be extremely careful not to disturb the larger rocks while removing the smaller one, because any shift in the pile could potentially crush Anders completely or cause additional rocks to fall. Every movement had to be calculated and controlled, with constant communication between the rescuers and the medical student who was monitoring Anders' condition. As they worked to remove the first rock, the medical student continued to monitor Anders' vital signs and breathing. The weight pressing down on his chest was making it increasingly difficult for him to maintain adequate oxygen levels, and there were concerns about internal bleeding from the impact to his shoulder. The race was on to free him before his condition deteriorated further. The psychological pressure on everyone involved was immense. The rescuers knew that one wrong move could kill Anders instantly, while the trapped party inside the cave could only wait in darkness and wonder if they would ever see daylight again. After what felt like hours of careful work, the rescue team successfully removed the smallest of the three rocks using their block and tackle system. This provided some relief for Anders' breathing, but he was still pinned under the two larger stones. The rescuers then assessed the remaining rocks and determined that they appeared to be stable enough to continue the extraction process without triggering another collapse. After a few more hours, the rescue team finally managed to remove enough of the massive rocks to free Glenn Anders from his stone prison. He was carefully extracted from the collapsed entrance and immediately transported to the hospital for a full medical evaluation. With Anders safely out, the rescue teams then focused on clearing enough of the entrance to allow the 14 trapped cave explorers to escape from their underground prison, ending what could have been one of Indiana's worst caving disasters. Back at the hospital, against all odds, the examination revealed that despite being crushed under tons of rock for hours, Anders had suffered no serious injuries. just the depressed area on his shoulder where the initial impact had occurred. He made a complete recovery. Dante's descent sits in the high desert country near Ash Fork, Arizona, about 50 miles west of Flagstaff. This isn't some well-known tourist attraction or marked scenic overlook. It's a remote, dangerous natural pit that drops straight down 300 feet, 91 meters, into the earth. The formation gets its ominous name from Dante's Inferno, and when you see this gaping hole in the desert floor, you understand why someone would connect it to the gates of hell. On September 23, 1986, 33-year-old Eugene Campbell had apparently been drawn to this remote desert pit. Campbell wasn't a professional or geologist. He was just a regular guy from the Kingman area who, for whatever reason, had become fascinated with Dante's descent. But here's where the story starts to get complicated and where the truth becomes much harder to pin down. A few days before September 23rd, two experienced cave explorers had encountered Campbell at Dante's descent under circumstances that were deeply concerning. They found him sitting alone at the edge of the pit, with his legs hanging over the side, drinking beer, and appearing what they described as very despondent. The two spelunkers who encountered Campbell were experienced enough to recognize that this was a potentially dangerous situation. They approached him and presumably tried to assess his state of mind, but Campbell eventually left the area. However, the spelunkers were sufficiently concerned about what they had witnessed. After Campbell left that day, his friends apparently became worried about him. According to reports, they were specifically concerned that he might be contemplating something. The fact that his friends were worried enough to come looking for him and that they were specifically concerned about something indicates that Campbell's visit to Dante's descent wasn't just a casual sightseeing trip. He had apparently been exhibiting behavior or expressing thoughts that made the people who cared about him worried. On the night of September 23rd, shortly after midnight, Eugene Campbell made the decision to return to Dante's descent. But this time, he wasn't alone. He had convinced a friend to come with him, possibly telling him they were just going to look at the formation, or maybe explore the upper edges of the pit. What happened next would haunt his friend for the rest of his life. The two men arrived at the remote desert location in the darkness, armed with flashlights and whatever gear they thought they might need. Dante's descent is an intimidating sight even during the day, but at night, with only artificial light to illuminate the massive void, it becomes something truly terrifying. The beam of a flashlight can't penetrate 300 feet, 91 meters of darkness. When you shine a light into Dante's descent at night, it just disappears into a black abyss. Campbell and his friend approach the edge of the pit, probably discussing their plans for exploring or examining the formation. Maybe Campbell was showing his friend the same spot where he had been sitting with his legs over the edge just days earlier. Maybe they were trying to get a better view of the pit's dimensions, or looking for a way to safely examine the upper portions of the cave system. But something went horribly wrong. According to the witness account, Campbell suddenly fell into the pit. One moment he was standing at the edge with his friend, and the next moment he was gone, plummeting 300 feet down into the darkness of Dante's descent. His friend watched in absolute horror as Campbell disappeared into the black void below. The sound of someone falling 300 feet would have been terrifying. First the silence as Campbell fell through the air, then the sickening impact as he hit the bottom of the pit. In the desert silence, those sounds would have echoed off the rock walls and carried for miles. Campbell's friend was suddenly alone at the edge of a massive pit, knowing that his companion had just fallen to almost certain death, but unable to do anything to help him. There was no way to climb down into Dante's descent, no way to reach Campbell, and probably no way to even see his body in the darkness at the bottom of the 300-foot drop. The psychological trauma of witnessing something like that would have been overwhelming. Campbell's friend had just watched someone he cared about fall to their death, and he was completely helpless to prevent it or provide any assistance. The guilt, shock, and horror of that moment would have been devastating. The friends somehow managed to get help, probably driving in a state of shock to find emergency services or other people who could assist with what was now clearly a recovery operation rather than a rescue. When emergency responders arrived at Dante's descent, they confirmed what Campbell's friend already knew. There was no way anyone could survive a 300-foot fall onto the rock floor of the pit. The recovery of Campbell's body was an extremely dangerous and complex operation. Professional rescue teams rappelled down 300 feet, about 90 meters, into the pit using specialized equipment. The teams involved in this operation were risking their own lives to bring Campbell back to his family. The terrain at Dante's descent made things especially difficult. The vertical walls of the shaft required ropes anchored into solid rock, and responders had to descend one by one, carefully managing their lines to avoid rockfall. At the bottom, working in darkness with only helmet lamps, they secured Campbell's body into a stretcher system designed for vertical hauling. Communication was maintained through radios, but even so, the sheer depth created delays and risks. Once everything was prepared, a coordinated pulley system was used to lift the stretcher inch by inch. But here's where the story gets complicated again, because even having a witness doesn't answer all the questions about what really happened that night. Did Campbell slip accidentally while trying to get a better look at the pit? Was he under the influence of alcohol, as suggested by his earlier drinking at the same location? Did his previous despondent behavior and his friends' concerns about him ending his life mean that this wasn't an accident at all? Campbell's friend would have been the only person who could answer these questions, but the trauma of witnessing such a horrific event might have affected his ability to provide clear details about exactly what happened in those crucial moments before Campbell fell. The fact that Campbell had been seen in a despondent state just days earlier, combined with his friend's specific concerns, raises the possibility that what looked like an accident to his friend might have actually been intentional. Someone who was planning to take their own life might not reveal their true intentions to the person they bring with them as a witness. Alternatively, Campbell might have been genuinely trying to show his friend something about the pit or get a better view of the cave system when he slipped and fell accidentally. The rocky, uneven ground around Dante's descent would be treacherous in the darkness, and one wrong step could easily send someone over the edge. Eugene Campbell's death at Dante's descent remains a tragedy regardless of whether it was accidental or intentional. A 33-year-old man lost his life in one of the most horrible ways imaginable, falling 300 feet into a dark pit in the middle of the Arizona desert. His friend was left with memories that would probably haunt him forever, and his family was left to grieve without fully understanding what had driven him to that remote, dangerous location in the middle of the night. On September 22, 1996, two recreational divers made a decision and chose to enter an underwater cave system without proper training, equipment, or guidelines. What happened next demonstrates exactly why cave diving is considered one of the most dangerous activities on Earth. Paradise Springs sits in Marion County, Florida, part of the extensive network of underwater cave systems that make Florida a world-renowned destination for cave diving. But like most Florida cave systems, Paradise Springs can be absolutely deadly if you don't know what you're doing. On this particular September day in 1996, two divers arrived at Paradise Springs for what they probably thought would be an exciting underwater adventure. These weren't professional cave divers or even cavern-certified recreational divers. They were open water divers, people who had basic scuba certification for diving in open ocean or lake environments, but no specialized training for the unique dangers of underwater caves. Here's the thing about open water diving versus cave diving. They're completely different activities that require completely different skills, equipment, and mindsets. Open water diving takes place in environments where you can always swim directly to the surface if something goes wrong. Cave diving takes place in overhead environments where there's no direct route to the surface, and one mistake can trap you underwater until your air runs out. The two divers made their first critical error before they even entered the water. They decided to explore the cave portion of Paradise Springs without a guideline. In cave diving, guidelines aren't just recommended equipment, they're absolutely essential survival tools. A guideline is literally a rope or line that cave divers lay behind them as they penetrate into a cave system, providing a direct route back to the entrance even in zero visibility conditions. Without a guideline, cave divers are essentially playing Russian roulette with their lives. If visibility gets compromised for any reason, and it almost always does, you can become instantly lost in an underwater maze with no way to find the exit before your air supply runs out. But these two open water divers didn't understand this fundamental principle of cave diving safety. They entered the cave portion of Paradise Springs without any form of navigation aid, relying on their ability to remember the route back to the entrance and maintain visual contact with their surroundings. The divers descended into the cave system, going deeper and deeper into the limestone passages. They reached a depth of 148 feet, 45 meters. A significant depth that would have put them well inside the cave system, far from any natural light and completely dependent on their artificial lighting to see anything. At 148 feet deep inside an underwater cave, these divers were in one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. They were in an overhead environment with no direct route to the surface. They were at a depth where nitrogen narcosis could impair their judgment, and they were completely dependent on their equipment functioning perfectly. Then, disaster struck in the form of a silt-out. Silt-outs are one of the most feared scenarios in cave diving. They occur when the fine sediment on the cave floor gets stirred up by divers' fins, equipment, or movements, creating a cloud of particles that reduces visibility to absolute zero. When a cave gets silted out, it's like someone turned off all the lights in an underwater maze. You literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. The two divers apparently caused a massive silt-out at 148 feet deep inside Paradise Springs. Whether they kicked the bottom too hard, bumped into a wall, or made some other movement that disturbed the sediment, the result was catastrophic. The clear water that had allowed them to navigate into the cave was suddenly replaced by a thick cloud of silt that made navigation impossible. In zero visibility conditions, the male diver apparently became separated from his partner. This is another nightmare scenario in cave diving. Losing contact with your dive buddy when you can't see anything means you're now completely alone in an underwater cave with no way to navigate back to the entrance. The male diver, probably panicking and disoriented by the complete loss of visibility, began searching frantically for a way out of the cave. Without a guideline to follow, he was essentially swimming blind through an underground maze, hoping to stumble across the exit before his air ran out. In his desperate search for an escape route, the diver made a fatal error. He attempted to squeeze through what he thought might be a passage leading toward the entrance, but instead wedged himself into a small crack or crevice in the cave wall. Once he was stuck in this tight space, he found that he couldn't move forward or backward. Picture this terrifying scenario. You're 148 feet underwater in complete darkness, trapped in a rock crevice that's just barely big enough for your body, with no guideline to show you the way out, and a finite air supply that's ticking down with every breath. The psychological terror of this situation would be overwhelming. Meanwhile, his diving partner was experiencing her own nightmare. She saw her companion disappear into the silt cloud, and then witnessed what appeared to be a cave collapse. From her perspective, it looked like the ceiling of the cave had fallen in and crushed her dive buddy. Believing that her partner was dead, and that the cave structure was unstable, she made the decision to ascend to the surface to get help. The female diver's ascent to the surface and call for help probably saved her own life, but it also meant that her partner was now completely alone in his underwater prison, with no one knowing his exact location or predicament. When emergency responders arrived at Paradise Springs about an hour later, they immediately began organizing a cave rescue operation. Professional cave diving rescue teams are equipped with specialized equipment, extensive training, and the experience needed to navigate dangerous underwater cave systems safely. The rescue divers entered the cave system following proper cave diving protocols. They laid guidelines behind them as they penetrated into the system, maintained proper visibility techniques to avoid creating silt-outs, and worked systematically to locate the missing diver. When the rescue team found the trapped diver, they discovered that he was wedged in a small crevice deep in the cave system. However, their initial attempts to extract him were unsuccessful due to the difficulty of maneuvering in the tight space and the complexity of the extraction process. The rescue teams called in the NSS Cave Diving Section Recovery Team, a specialized group of expert cave divers who handle the most difficult underwater recoveries. When this elite team arrived and began their own investigation, they made a discovery that changed the entire understanding of what had happened. The cave had not collapsed, as the female diver had believed. Her partner had not been crushed by falling rocks. Instead, the recovery team found evidence of what had actually occurred in those final, desperate moments. The trapped diver, wedged in the crevice and probably running low on air, had apparently convinced himself that he could not get free from his rocky prison. In what must have been a moment of absolute panic and desperation, he made a decision that sealed his fate. He released his diving harness, somehow managed to back out of the crevice that had been holding him prisoner, and then began what's called a free ascent, swimming toward the surface while holding his breath, without any artificial light to guide him. A free ascent from 148 feet, 45 meters underwater, is extremely dangerous under the best of circumstances. The diver would have had to hold his breath while swimming upward through a complex cave system, navigating in complete darkness, trying to find passages that led toward the surface rather than deeper into the cave. The tragic irony is that by releasing his harness and backing out of the crevice, the diver had actually freed himself from his trap. If he had remained calm, kept his diving equipment, and followed proper emergency procedures, he might have been able to survive long enough for the rescue teams to extract him. But panic and desperation drove him to make a series of decisions that turned a potentially survivable situation into a fatal one. Swimming upward in complete darkness through an underwater cave system while holding your breath is essentially impossible. The diver would have quickly become disoriented, run out of breath, and drowned in the flooded passages. The recovery team found his body at approximately the 44-foot, 13-meter level, suggesting that he had managed to swim partway toward the surface before succumbing to drowning. He had come tantalizingly close to reaching shallower water, but not close enough to save his life. The Paradise Springs tragedy illustrates several critical lessons about cave diving safety. First, open water diving certification is completely inadequate preparation for cave diving. Second, guidelines are not optional equipment in cave diving. They are essential safety tools that can mean the difference between life and death when visibility is compromised. Third, panic is often more dangerous than the original emergency in cave diving situations. The trapped diver might have survived if he had remained calm, conserved his air, and waited for rescue teams to extract him. His decision to abandon his equipment and attempt a free ascent turned a difficult rescue into a fatal accident. On October 15, 1994, 6 experienced spelunkers entered Turkey Cave in Virginia with permission to survey a system that had been closed for years. What they encountered deep inside would turn into them running away from death itself. Turkey Cave sits in Rockbridge County, Virginia, part of the extensive cave systems that run through the Appalachian region. By October 1994, the cave had been closed to explorers for several years, sealed off by authorities for reasons that weren't entirely clear to the caving community. But Benjamin Schwartz, John Murray, Bob Thren, Janice and Tony Preston, and Ted Andrus had managed to obtain special permission to enter and conduct a survey of the cave system. The group made their way through the entrance passages, the walls dropped down quickly, and they had to crawl on their bellies. Then the passages quickly widened, which led directly to the big room, a large chamber that was a major landmark in the cave system. From the big room, the group entered a passageway that they knew led to a 15-foot, 4.5-meter drop down to the lower level of the cave. This passage would take them deeper into the system where they could conduct their survey work. The 6 cave explorers moved in formation, each one following the person ahead through the narrowing passage. Only a few feet into this passage, Janice Preston suddenly developed a breathing problem. She started gasping for air, her chest tightening as she struggled to get adequate oxygen. For experienced spelunkers, this was unusual and concerning, but the passage ahead had a tight constriction that needed to be negotiated, and there wasn't much room to stop and assess the situation. Janice pushed herself through the tight constriction, probably thinking that once she got through the narrow section, she would feel better. She dropped down into a small room on the other side and finally managed to catch her breath. Her breathing stabilized, and she felt somewhat better in the confined chamber. The rest of the group assessed Janice's condition and tried to figure out what had caused her breathing difficulty. She had taken some medication earlier that morning, and the group collectively decided that was probably the cause of her problem. It seemed like a reasonable explanation. Medication can sometimes cause unexpected side effects, including breathing difficulties, especially when combined with physical exertion in caves. So, they decided to continue with the survey, convinced that Janice's breathing problem was just a minor issue related to her medication. But then, John Murray mentioned something that should have been a major warning sign. His carbide lamp was having trouble staying lit. Carbide lamps work by dripping water onto calcium carbide, which produces acetylene gas that burns with a bright flame. They're reliable light sources that have been used by cavers for decades, and they don't just randomly malfunction. Other members of the group started noticing the same problem with their lamps. The flames were flickering, dimming, and some of the lamps kept going out entirely and had to be relit repeatedly. Benjamin Schwartz had reached the rigging point for the 15-foot drop to the lower level, but he was having trouble catching his breath. His chest felt tight, and he was breathing harder than he should have been for the level of exertion. As he stood there trying to steady his breathing, he noticed something alarming about the carbide lamps. The flames were burning with an unusual yellow, sooty appearance instead of the normal bright white flame. Some of the lamps wouldn't stay lit at all, no matter how many times people tried to relight them. And then it hit Schwartz like a freight train. They were in bad air. Bad air in caves is one of the most insidious and deadly hazards that cavers can encounter. It's invisible, odorless, and kills by slowly depleting the oxygen in your blood until you lose consciousness and die. Everyone in the group began experiencing severe trouble breathing. What had started with Janice's isolated difficulty was now affecting all 6 of them simultaneously. Their chests were tightening, their breathing was becoming labored, and they were starting to feel dizzy and disoriented. Schwartz made the call that they needed to exit the cave immediately, but making that decision and actually executing it were 2 very different things. The group was deep in the cave system, they had to navigate back through tight passages and constrictions, and they were all experiencing symptoms of oxygen deprivation that were getting worse by the second. Ted Andrus was hit particularly hard by the bad air. His thinking became severely impaired as oxygen deprivation affected his brain function. The group was now in a terrifying situation. They were deep in a cave system with air that was literally suffocating them. One of their members was becoming incapacitated, and they had to navigate through tight passages and constrictions while their physical and mental abilities were rapidly deteriorating. Andrus's condition continued to decline as they moved through the passages. His movements became slower and more uncoordinated. The others realized that Andrus was on the verge of losing consciousness completely. If he passed out in the narrow passages, getting him out would become nearly impossible. Their hearts were racing as their cardiovascular systems tried desperately to compensate for the lack of oxygen by pumping blood faster. Some members of the group were experiencing such severe fatigue that every step felt like climbing a mountain. As they struggled back toward the big room, Andrus's condition reached a critical point. The others knew that if Andrus lost consciousness in the bad air, he would die before they could get him out. The group made the difficult decision that they had to physically help Andrus move. They couldn't wait for him to recover or hope that he would make it on his own power. Bob Thren and Tony Preston positioned themselves on either side of Andrus and began essentially dragging him through the passages toward better air. Moving a nearly unconscious person through tight cave passages while you're also suffering from oxygen deprivation is an incredibly difficult task. The other members of the group, Schwartz, Murray, and Janice, were barely managing to keep themselves moving. They were fighting their own battles with the bad air, Every minute felt like an hour as the group struggled toward the big room. They could feel themselves getting weaker, their vision starting to tunnel as their brains were deprived of adequate oxygen. The carbide lamps were still producing those ominous yellow, sooty flames. Andrus was fading in and out of consciousness as Thren and Preston dragged him forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of desperate struggle, the group reached the big room. The air quality in the larger chamber was dramatically better. There was enough circulation and volume that the oxygen content was closer to normal levels. As they entered the big room, it was like breaking the surface of water after being held underwater too long. Everyone in the group started gulping in air, their lungs finally able to extract adequate oxygen. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Andrus, who had been on the verge of losing consciousness completely, he slowly began to recover as his blood oxygen levels returned to normal. He was placed in a safe position where he could catch his breath and recover from his near-death experience with oxygen deprivation. The group sat in the big room for an extended period, allowing their bodies to fully recover from the ordeal. Before leaving the cave, the group made sure to leave a clear warning sign above the passage that had nearly killed them. They marked it as containing bad air and dangerous to enter, hoping to prevent other cavers from making the same mistake they had made. When they finally exited Turkey Cave and emerged into the fresh Virginia air, the entire group understood just how close they had come to becoming fatalities. If they had descended that 15-foot drop into the lower level before recognizing the bad air, they would have been trapped in an area with even lower oxygen content, possibly too weak to climb back up, and they would have died down there. A follow-up expedition on October 21st used an air quality meter to measure the oxygen content in various parts of the cave. Normal air contains about 21% oxygen. The passage where these guys had turned back measured only 17% oxygen, dangerously low, but still survivable for short periods. Below 15% oxygen, the air becomes immediately life-threatening. The meter showed that oxygen levels decreased rapidly as the passage descended deeper. Had the group continued down that 15-foot drop, they would have entered an area with potentially fatal oxygen levels, and they would not have had the strength or consciousness to climb back out. On January 5th, 2023, an experienced diver descended into the waters off the coast of Mexico for what should have been a routine day of harvesting shellfish. Tilbury Bay sits along the coast of Sonora, Mexico, in the Gulf of California, a body of water that's sometimes called the aquarium of the world because of its incredible marine biodiversity. The waters here are rich with sea life, from tiny plankton to massive whales, and everything in between. For local fishermen, these waters represent their livelihood, providing abundant catches of fish, shellfish, and other valuable marine resources. Manuel Nieblas Lopez was 53 years old in January 2023, and he was about as experienced as divers get in this part of Mexico. He had spent decades working these waters, diving to depths that would make most recreational divers uncomfortable, and harvesting various species of shellfish that were prized in local and international markets. Lopez wasn't some weekend hobbyist. He was a professional who understood the ocean, respected its dangers, and had survived countless dives without serious incident. On this particular morning, Lopez was part of a small crew that had set out to harvest calo de hacha, axe scallops, a valuable mollusk that's commonly collected throughout the Gulf of California. These scallops live on the seafloor at significant depths. Lopez was using a surface-supplied air system for this dive, which is significantly different from the scuba tanks that most people are familiar with. Instead of carrying compressed air on his back, Lopez was connected to the surface vessel by a long air hose that provided him with a continuous supply of breathing gas. This system allowed him to stay underwater for extended periods without worrying about running out of air. He could work for hours at a time, as long as the compressor on the boat kept running. The plan for the day was straightforward. Lopez would descend to the seafloor, somewhere between 11 and 18 meters, 36 to 59 feet, deep, and systematically harvest the axe scallops he found. His companions would remain on the support vessel above, managing his air supply, monitoring his progress through the air hose, and helping him load his harvest when he surfaced. As Lopez descended that morning, the water conditions were less than ideal. The visibility was relatively murky, not terrible, but not the crystal clear water that makes diving pleasant and safe. In murky water, it's harder to see potential dangers approaching, but he kept on descending towards his goal. Eventually, he was able to reach towards his destination. Lopez was working near the seafloor, moving among schools of fish as he searched for scallops to harvest. He was wearing a black wetsuit, standard equipment for divers working in these waters, and his movements through the water created vibrations and disturbances that any nearby predators could detect from considerable distances. What Lopez and his crew didn't know was that they weren't alone in Tilbury Bay that morning. Somewhere in the murky waters below, a massive great white shark was cruising through the area. This particular shark was enormous, estimated to be about 6 meters or 19 feet long, which is close to the maximum size that great white sharks typically reach. To put that in perspective, a 19-foot great white shark weighs somewhere around 2,000 to 2,500 pounds and has a mouth full of serrated teeth that can exert bite forces of up to 4,000 pounds per square inch. These are apex predators that have been perfecting their hunting techniques for millions of years, and they're capable of killing large prey with a single bite. What happened next occurred so quickly that Lopez probably never knew what hit him. The great white shark attacked with the explosive speed and power that makes these predators so terrifying. Great whites don't slowly circle their prey like in the movies. When they attack, they come from below at incredible velocity, using the element of surprise to ensure their prey has no chance to escape or defend itself. The shark struck Lopez with immense force, its jaws closing around his upper body in a single, catastrophic bite. The impact was so violent and the bite so powerful that it instantly decapitated Lopez and inflicted massive trauma to his shoulders and upper torso. This wasn't a test bite or an exploratory nibble. This was a full predatory strike from one of the ocean's most powerful predators. The crew members on the support vessel above had no warning that anything was wrong. One moment they were monitoring Lopez's dive through the air hose, and the next moment they felt unusual tension or movement in the line. They immediately began pulling Lopez back to the surface, probably thinking he had encountered some problem with his equipment or had gotten tangled in something on the seafloor. When they pulled Lopez's body to the surface, the scene that greeted them was something out of a nightmare. Their experienced colleague and friend had been essentially destroyed by the shark attack. The decapitation and massive injuries to his upper body made it immediately clear that he was dead, and that his death had been instantaneous. The entire attack had unfolded in a matter of seconds. From the moment the shark struck to the moment Lopez died was probably less than 5 seconds, possibly even less than 2 seconds. There was no prolonged struggle, no opportunity to fight back or escape. The great white shark had done what millions of years of evolution had designed it to do: identify prey, attack with overwhelming force, and kill instantly. The witnesses were unable to react or intervene because the entire event happened so quickly and so deep below the surface. By the time they pulled Lopez up, there was nothing that could be done to save him. The trauma was so severe that even if medical personnel had been standing by, Lopez's injuries were instantly fatal. Marine biologists and shark experts who investigated the incident later confirmed that Lopez's injuries were consistent with a single predatory bite from a large great white shark. This is actually relatively rare. Most shark attacks on humans are cases of mistaken identity where the shark takes a single exploratory bite and then leaves. But in this case, the shark's bite was so powerful and so well placed that a single strike was sufficient to cause fatal injuries. The experts noted several factors that likely contributed to the attack. Here's where the tragic circumstances of this attack become clear. From below, Lopez would have presented a very specific silhouette against the lighter water above, a dark, roughly seal-shaped object, moving through the water in an area where the great white shark was hunting. Sea lions are one of the great white's preferred prey species in this region, and sharks have evolved to recognize and target that particular shape and movement pattern. Second, the murky water conditions that morning would have made it difficult for the shark to distinguish between a human diver and its natural prey until it was too close to abort the attack. Third, Lopez's surface-supplied air system meant he was tethered to the boat above, potentially creating vibrations or movements in the water that could attract predatory attention. Marine biologists noted that there had been reports of increased shark presence in the area, possibly linked to seasonal migrations and warmer water temperatures that were affecting marine animal distributions throughout the Gulf of California. The incident sparked renewed discussions about diver safety in the Gulf of California and the need for better understanding of shark behavior and distribution patterns in Mexican waters. Some experts suggested that divers working in areas with known shark populations should consider using shark deterrent devices, working in groups for mutual protection, or avoiding areas where sharks have been recently sighted. For Lopez's family, the loss was devastating. He was an experienced professional who had spent his entire adult life working in these waters without serious incident. He understood the risks of his profession and took appropriate precautions. But sometimes, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, when a large predator mistakes you for its natural prey, is a risk that no amount of experience or precaution can completely eliminate. In 2005, an experienced cave diver entered a remote British cave system to continue exploration work that had been abandoned 30 years earlier. What he found in those dark, silty passages would trap him in a nightmare scenario, where every movement made his situation worse, and time itself became his enemy. Low Burkewith Cave is located in the Yorkshire Dales of England, part of the extensive limestone cave systems that run through this region of northern Britain. The cave had been partially explored back in the 1970s by pioneering cave divers who had pushed into the flooded passages as far as their equipment and techniques would allow them at the time. But cave diving technology and techniques had advanced significantly in the 3 decades since those original explorations. What had been the absolute limit of possibility in the 1970s was now considered achievable with modern equipment and training. This made caves like Low Burkewith attractive targets for experienced divers who wanted to push beyond where the previous generations had stopped. Colin Pryor was exactly the kind of diver qualified to take on this challenge. He was an experienced cave diver who understood the unique dangers of exploring flooded underground passages. He knew about silt outs, entanglement hazards, navigation challenges, and all the other risks that make cave diving one of the most dangerous activities on Earth. Pryor had undertaken a project to revisit Low Burkewith Cave and extend the exploration beyond. The sections of Low Burkewith that Pryor was diving through were characterized by low, narrow passages filled with fine silt. The passages are so tight that divers often have to remove their equipment and push it ahead of them to squeeze through. In the 1970s, when the original divers pushed into Low Burkewith, they laid guideline through the passages they explored. But when those divers finished their exploration and decided they had reached the limit of what was possible, they didn't remove all their guidelines. When cave divers explore new passages, they lay guidelines behind them as they penetrate deeper into the system. This line serves as their lifeline back to open water. In zero visibility conditions, following the line is the only way to navigate back to safety. In the 1970s, some sections were left in place, either because they were too difficult to recover or because the divers thought they might be useful for future explorations. Over the course of 30 years, this old line had deteriorated, become loose, and was now floating freely in the flooded passages like deadly underwater spider webs. Pryor entered the water and began his dive, following proper cave diving protocols. He was laying his own guideline as he penetrated deeper into the system, creating a safe route back to the entrance. He navigated through the tight, low passages, carefully managing his movements to avoid stirring up the fine silt that covered every surface. As Pryor pushed deeper into the cave system, he began encountering the old guideline from the 1970s explorations. At first, this wasn't necessarily alarming. It actually confirmed that he was following the same route the original divers had taken. But what Pryor didn't immediately realize was just how degraded and dangerous this old line had become. The guideline from the 1970s had been floating in the flooded passages for 3 decades. The constant water flow, the chemical processes in the cave water, and simply the passage of time had weakened the line and caused it to separate from many of its anchor points. Instead of being a taut, secure line attached to the cave walls, it had become loose and floating, drifting in the current like seaweed. As Pryor continued deeper into the system, he began to encounter more and more of this loose, deteriorated line. It was everywhere in the passage, draped across the route, hanging from the ceiling, coiled on the floor. In the confined space of the low passage, it was almost impossible to avoid contact with the old line. As he maneuvered through a particularly tight section, the old guideline wrapped around his equipment. Maybe it caught on his tank valve, or his dive light, or one of the clips on his harness. In the confined space and limited visibility, Pryor didn't even notice it at first. But as he continued moving forward, the entanglement got worse. The old line wrapped around more of his equipment, creating loops and tangles that became increasingly complex with every movement he made. Pryor realized he was caught, and he immediately stopped moving forward to assess his situation. In cave diving, entanglement is one of the most feared hazards because it can quickly become a death trap. The more you struggle against the entanglement, the worse it typically gets. But Pryor was an experienced diver who understood this. Pryor reached for his knife, which all cave divers carry for exactly this kind of situation. He began carefully cutting away the old guideline that had wrapped around his equipment, trying to free himself without creating a silt out, or damaging his own freshly laid guideline that was his route back to safety. But here's where the terrible reality of his situation became clear. The old line wasn't just wrapped around one piece of equipment. It was tangled around multiple points on his body and gear, creating a complex web of entanglement in the confined passage. Every time Pryor cut away one section of line, he would discover more tangles elsewhere. And all of this was happening in a low, narrow passage where he couldn't easily see his own equipment, couldn't move freely to reach all the entanglement points, and was constantly at risk of stirring up the fine silt that would reduce visibility to zero. As Pryor worked to free himself, his air supply steadily depleted with each breath. Cave divers follow the rule of thirds. Use 1/3 of your air to penetrate into the cave, 1/3 to exit, and keep 1/3 in reserve for emergencies. But Pryor's emergency was consuming air faster than he had planned, and he was still deep in the cave system. Pryor realized at some point that he was in serious trouble. The entanglement was more complex than he initially thought. His air supply was running lower than it should be for his position in the cave, and he was still firmly trapped by the old guideline. The silt was stirring up because of all his movement, and now he couldn't even see anything. Visibility was zero. Pryor was working largely by feel, trying to locate the entangling lines with his hands and cut them away with his knife while suspended in a narrow underwater passage with zero visibility. He intensified his efforts to cut himself free, working faster. But the old line was everywhere. Every time he freed himself from one tangle, his movements would cause him to become caught in another section of the degraded guideline that was floating throughout the passage. As his air supply continued to drop, Pryor was forced to make increasingly desperate decisions. Every option had serious risks, and the clock was ticking down with every breath he took from his rapidly depleting air supply. The final minutes of Colin Pryor's life would have been absolutely terrifying. He was an experienced diver who understood exactly what was happening to him. He knew that his air was running out. He knew that he was still trapped, and he knew that time had run out for any chance of freeing himself and reaching safety. As his air supply finally ran out completely, Pryor would have taken his last breaths from his tank, feeling the increasing resistance as the regulator struggled to deliver air from the nearly empty cylinder. Then there would have been nothing. Just the desperate, instinctive attempt to breathe underwater that accomplishes nothing except filling the lungs with water. Colin Pryor drowned in that low, silty passage in Low Burkewith Cave, trapped by old guidelines that had been left behind by divers 30 years earlier. His body was eventually recovered by other experienced cave divers who entered the system to bring him back to the surface. But the recovery operation was extremely dangerous and difficult due to the same tight, silty conditions that had claimed Pryor's life. They saw his body floating, tangled in the aged line, with cuts at different places. The sight told a horrific story. In that haunting stillness, the cave revealed the final moments of a life lost far beneath the surface. In March 27, 1982, the Sparta Mountains of northern New Jersey rose against a gray spring sky as Sergeant Donald Weltner prepared for what should have been a routine Boy Scout expedition. At 48 years old, Weltner was a 22-year veteran of the New Jersey State Police and an experienced spelunker who had explored dozens of cave systems throughout the region. Today, he was taking 12 Boy Scouts, including his own 2 sons, Christopher and Roger, aged 12 and 14, into Crooked Swamp Cave, New Jersey's longest cave system. Another scoutmaster named Jim Ewing was also along to help supervise the large group of boys. Weltner had led similar expeditions before, without incident. He knew caves, he understood their dangers, he was trained, experienced, and careful. But caves don't care about experience or caution, they only care about physics and geology. The expedition was going well as the group made their way through the known passages of the cave system. The boys were probably having the time of their lives, exploring the underground world with their flashlights and experiencing the unique thrill that comes from being deep underground in a natural cave formation. At some point during the expedition, Weltner noticed an uncharted passage, a section of the cave that hadn't been mapped or explored in any detail. These uncharted passages held a magnetic appeal for experienced ones like Weltner. The chance to explore a virgin cave, to see formations that no human had ever witnessed, was irresistible to those who loved the underground world. That afternoon, Weltner spotted one of these unexplored passages. It was a narrow opening, roughly 18 inches by 20 inches, 46 by 51 centimeters, tight, but seemed navigable for an experienced spelunker. Weltner made the decision to crawl into this uncharted passage to see where it led. This wasn't reckless behavior. He was an experienced explorer who understood cave safety and knew how to assess whether a passage was safe to explore. The opening appeared stable and navigable, and Weltner likely felt confident that he could safely investigate this unmapped section. What Weltner couldn't have known was that this particular passage contained a deadly trap, a natural stone mechanism that would turn his body into the key that locked itself tighter with every movement. He squeezed into the crevice. The passage angled slightly downward, requiring him to crawl on his stomach, pushing himself forward with his legs and pulling with his arms. This type of crawl is called a squeeze. It's one of the most dangerous types of cave passage because it severely limits a caver's ability to maneuver. If something goes wrong in a squeeze, rescue becomes exponentially more difficult. Weltner pushed deeper into the passage. Then his forward progress stopped. Something was blocking the way ahead. A large limestone boulder sat wedged in the narrow crevice. The logical decision would have been to back out immediately, but Weltner may have thought he could shift the boulder or find a way around it. He pushed against the rock. The boulder moved, but it didn't move forward or to the side. Instead, it shifted in a way that Weltner couldn't have predicted. The rock was acting as what engineers call a keystone, a structural element that, when disturbed, causes catastrophic changes in the surrounding system. It was a rock that was helping to hold other rocks in place. When this keystone shifted, it triggered a mechanical trap that no one could have predicted. As the boulder moved, the rock settled into a new position that allowed Weltner to move forward slightly. But when he tried to reverse direction and back out of the passage, the boulder pressed tighter against him. But here's what made this trap so diabolical. Forward movement loosened the pressure slightly, backward movement tightened it, and Weltner was now 17 feet, 5.2 meters underground, in a space so tight he could barely breathe, let alone maneuver. It was like a Chinese finger trap made of limestone. He was trapped. Weltner would have immediately understood the severity of his situation. He was an experienced caver who knew that getting stuck in a tight passage is one of the most dangerous things that can happen underground. He probably tried multiple times to work himself backward, only to feel the stone press tighter against him with each attempt. What made Weltner's situation even more tragic was that the pressure from the stone was causing him to bleed. Either a rock had fallen and struck his head when the keystone dislodged, or the constant pressure from the stone was causing trauma that led to bleeding. Whatever the cause, Weltner was losing blood in a position where he couldn't apply pressure to the wound or do anything to stop the bleeding. Weltner's 2 sons and Jim Ewing apparently tried desperately to rescue him themselves. They probably tried pulling on his legs, tried to manipulate the rocks around him, and attempted everything they could think of to free him from the stone trap. But the geometry of the situation made it impossible. Any pulling from behind would only make the stone press tighter against him. For several hours, the boys and Ewing worked to free Weltner before they finally made the difficult decision to leave him and get help. This must have been agonizing for Weltner's sons, leaving their father trapped and injured in a dark cave passage while they went for help. But it was the only option that gave him any chance of survival. When authorities were notified and rescue workers arrived at Crooked Swamp Cave, they quickly realized they were facing an extremely difficult and dangerous rescue operation. Weltner was trapped 17 feet underground in a narrow crevice, held in place by a stone that would only tighten if they tried to pull him out. They couldn't simply extract him the way he had entered. They would have to somehow remove or bypass the stone that was trapping him. In the first several hours after the rescue operation began, Weltner remained coherent and able to communicate with the rescue workers. He talked to them from his stone prison, probably trying to describe exactly how he was trapped and what had happened when the keystone dislodged. At one point, displaying the kind of composure that you'd expect from a 22-year veteran state trooper, Weltner even asked the rescue workers to tell his wife that he would be late arriving home. But as the hours passed, Weltner's condition deteriorated. The combination of being trapped in a confined space, the ongoing blood loss from his head injury, the cold temperature of the cave, and the psychological stress of his situation were all taking their toll on his body. At 2 a.m. on Sunday morning, roughly 12 hours after Weltner became trapped, rescue workers heard their last communication from him. Not words, but grunts. Small sounds that indicated he was still alive, still fighting. Then silence. By Monday morning, State Police Superintendent Colonel Clinton Pagano grimly reported that they could detect no vital signs. But the rescue workers never stopped. They continued placing hot water bottles, continued drilling and blasting, continued hoping for a miracle. The site became a muddy disaster zone. Heavy equipment churned the ground into ankle-deep muck. Generators roared constantly, powering lights and tools. Dozens of rescuers worked in shifts, never stopping, never giving up. For 80 hours straight, they worked. 3.5 days of continuous effort to free one man from 17 feet of limestone and a boulder that acted like a mechanical trap. On Tuesday night, late, they finally broke through. But the victory was hollow. 20 minutes before his body was pulled free, Donald Weltner had been officially pronounced dead. Dr. Lucian Fletcher Jr. stated that Weltner had actually been dead for some time before the official pronouncement, probably since sometime Sunday, meaning he had been dead for roughly 2.5 days while the rescue effort continued. When they finally pulled Weltner's body free from the crevice, blood could be seen on the limestone boulder where his head had been resting. The extent of his head injury became clear. The stone trap that had held Weltner was fully revealed once his body was removed. The boulder had acted as a keystone. When Weltner pushed it, it shifted into a position that tightened like a mechanical vise whenever he tried to back out. Every instinctive attempt to reverse course only made the trap tighter. Forward movement loosened it slightly, but going forward meant going deeper into an unmapped passage with no exit. His head injury was brutal as well. Pagano also revealed that Weltner had lost a significant amount of blood, which accounted for his rapid decline. Whether the injury came from the initial rock fall when he became trapped, or from stones loosened during the rescue drilling and blasting was unclear. Either way, the blood loss had been catastrophic in an environment where medical intervention was impossible. Weltner's brother Carl, also a scout leader, stood silently in the mud as his brother's body was removed and placed in an ambulance. 60 miles away in Perrinville, Weltner's wife had maintained a tense vigil throughout the ordeal. When state troopers delivered the news of her husband's death, several officers stayed with her, offering what comfort they could to a woman who had lost her husband to the underground world he loved. Weltner's body was transported to Newton Memorial Hospital for autopsy. The cause of death would be officially recorded, adding one more statistic to the long list of caving fatalities that mark the sport's dangerous history. On February 16, 2002, Two experienced cave divers entered the crystal-clear waters of Little River Spring in Florida for what should have been a routine dive. What happened in those underwater caves remains a mystery to this day. Little River Spring is located in northern Florida, part of the vast network of underwater cave systems that snake through the limestone bedrock of the region. These aren't your typical scuba diving spots. We're talking about serious cave diving territory, where only the most experienced and certified divers dare to venture. The water is crystal clear, the formations are spectacular, but the environment is absolutely unforgiving. Pete Reagan was 55 years old and about as experienced as cave divers get. He had over 300 logged cave dives under his belt. That's not someone who was new to this game. He was certified, experienced, and had been diving these Florida cave systems for years without incident. Frank Murphy, 43, was also an experienced cave diver and Reagan's diving partner for this expedition. On this particular February day, Reagan and Murphy were diving with a group of friends at Little River Spring. The plan was straightforward. They would enter the cave system, explore some of the deeper passages, and make their way back to the entrance before their air supplies ran low. It was the kind of dive they had both done hundreds of times before. The group descended into the cave system and began their underwater exploration. The visibility was excellent, the water temperature was comfortable, and everything was going according to plan. The group had planned to dive all the way to an area called the Dome Room, a large chamber deep within the cave system that's considered one of the highlights of Little River Spring. But as they approached the area, the dive leader made a conservative decision that probably saved some lives that day. He called for the group to turn their dive before reaching the Dome Room and begin their exit back toward the entrance. This is standard procedure in cave diving. You always leave plenty of air in reserve for the exit, and you never push the limits of your air supply or your dive time. The dive leader was following proper safety protocols by calling the dive early and ensuring everyone had adequate air to make it back to the surface. As the group began their exit from the cave system, two of the divers decided to make a side trip up towards Harper Tunnel, a smaller passage that branches off from the main route. This left Pete Reagan and Frank Murphy to continue toward the entrance together, with Murphy taking the lead position and Reagan following behind. This is where everything went horribly wrong, and to this day, nobody knows exactly why. Murphy was swimming steadily toward the entrance, following the main passage back toward daylight and safety. The dive was going perfectly. They had plenty of air, good visibility, and were making good time back toward the surface. Murphy was focused on navigation and maintaining proper spacing with his dive partner. About 500 feet, 152 meters from the entrance, Murphy realized something was terribly wrong. He looked back to check on Reagan's position and discovered that his dive partner wasn't behind him. In cave diving, losing sight of your partner is one of the most dangerous things that can happen. Murphy immediately turned back upstream to look for Reagan, swimming against the gentle current that flows through the cave system. What he found about 40 feet, 12 meters behind him was the stuff of nightmares. Pete Reagan was in full-body convulsions. Picture this scene. You're 500 feet inside an underwater cave, swimming through passages that are barely wide enough for one person, and you find your dive partner having what appears to be a massive seizure while underwater. Reagan's entire body was convulsing violently, and he was completely unconscious and unresponsive. Murphy's training kicked in immediately. He swam to Reagan's aid and managed to get his regulator, the breathing device that delivers air from the scuba tank, back into Reagan's mouth. But when Murphy checked Reagan's breathing, he realized the situation was even worse than he'd thought. Reagan wasn't breathing at all. Murphy began forced ventilation using Reagan's regulator, pressing the purge valve to force air directly into Reagan's lungs. This is an incredibly difficult and dangerous procedure to perform underwater, especially when you're both wearing full scuba gear in a confined cave passage. Murphy was essentially performing artificial respiration while swimming, trying to keep both of them alive in an environment where one mistake could kill them both. The forced ventilation seemed to work initially. Reagan began breathing intermittently, taking irregular breaths as Murphy continued the emergency procedure. But the breathing kept stopping, forcing Murphy to repeatedly perform forced ventilation as he tried to tow Reagan's unconscious body back toward the cave entrance. Murphy was now in an impossible situation. He was trying to perform life-saving medical procedures on his unconscious partner while navigating through tight underwater cave passages, all while managing his own air supply and fighting against the current. The physical and mental demands of the situation were enormous, and Murphy knew that time was running out for both of them. As Murphy struggled to tow Reagan toward the entrance while maintaining forced ventilation, his own air supply was being rapidly depleted. The increased exertion of the rescue effort, combined with the stress and adrenaline of the situation, was causing him to consume air much faster than normal. About 30 feet, 9 meters, before they reached the entrance, Murphy ran out of air completely. In a desperate move, Murphy switched to Reagan's air supply. This meant that both divers were now dependent on a single air source, and if that tank ran empty before they reached the surface, both men would drown in the cave. Murphy continued towing Reagan's unconscious body while breathing from his partner's regulator, racing against time and rapidly diminishing air supplies. Somehow, Murphy managed to reach the cave entrance with Reagan still alive but unconscious. As they emerged from the underwater cave system into the spring pool, other divers and support personnel who had been waiting at the surface immediately sprang into action. They pulled Reagan from the water and began CPR immediately. These were experienced cave divers who knew emergency procedures, and they worked frantically to try to restart Reagan's heart and get him breathing on his own. The scene at the spring was chaotic but organized, with multiple people taking turns performing chest compressions and rescue breathing. When paramedics arrived at Little River Spring, they took over the resuscitation efforts and immediately transported Reagan to the nearest hospital. The medical team continued working on him during transport and after arrival at the emergency room, using every available technique to try to save his life. But despite all the heroic efforts by Murphy, the other divers, and the medical personnel, Pete Reagan never regained consciousness. The 55-year-old experienced cave diver with over 300 logged cave dives had suffered some kind of medical emergency deep inside the cave system, and whatever happened to him in those underwater passages proved to be fatal. Medical examiners and diving medicine specialists investigated the incident thoroughly, but they were never able to determine exactly what triggered the massive convulsions that occurred 500 feet inside the cave. Reagan had no known history of seizures or other medical conditions that would have predicted this kind of emergency. Some theories included decompression sickness, nitrogen narcosis, or some kind of underlying medical condition that had never been diagnosed. But whatever the case, it would always remain a mystery. On the night of November 1st, 1986, 5 college students decided to dig their way into a sealed cave near their campus. The caves near Northfield, Minnesota, aren't massive tourist attractions or well-known geological wonders. They're a part of the limestone cave systems that are scattered throughout the upper Midwest. Most of these caves are small, tight passages that attract local spelunkers and curious college students looking for underground adventure. St. Olaf College sits right in Northfield, and like many college towns, it has its share of local legends and mysterious places that students whisper about. The caves in the area had become something of a local attraction for adventurous students over the years, the kind of place where you might go with friends to explore, have a few drinks, or just do something that felt rebellious and exciting. But here's the thing about the particular cave system that would become the focus of our story. It had been deliberately sealed 8 years earlier. This wasn't an accident or natural occurrence. Local authorities had made a conscious decision to fill the entrance with dirt and debris to prevent people from entering. When caves get sealed like this, it's usually for very good reasons. Maybe the cave system is unstable, maybe there have been accidents, or maybe the passages are too dangerous for inexperienced explorers. On this particular Saturday night in November, 5 students from St. Olaf College made the decision to ignore the fact that the cave had been sealed. These weren't seasoned cave explorers with proper equipment and training. They were college kids looking for adventure, who probably had no idea why the cave entrance had been filled in the first place. The group included Thomas E. Johnson, a 20-year-old student who was presumably looking forward to what seemed like a fun, late-night exploration with his friends. The 5 students arrived at the sealed cave entrance sometime that evening, probably armed with nothing more than flashlights and the kind of confidence that comes with being young and thinking you're invincible. When they examined the sealed entrance, they found it completely blocked with dirt, rocks, and debris that had been deliberately placed there to prevent exactly what they were planning to do. A smart group would have looked at this obvious barrier and realized that maybe this wasn't a place they should be trying to enter. But these 5 students decided to dig. Using nothing but their bare hands and a single pail to remove the dirt and debris, they began the backbreaking work of tunneling through the sealed entrance. As they made some progress, they felt that the cave was stable, with maybe water flowing through the cracks, solidifying all the dirt and debris. This wasn't easy work. They were essentially creating a horizontal tunnel through packed earth and rocks, working in cramped conditions with limited lighting and no proper tools. Think about what they were doing for a moment. They were digging a tunnel through unstable fill material that had been deliberately placed to block access to the cave. The dirt and debris wasn't naturally occurring sediment that had been deposited over time. It was loose fill that had been dumped into the entrance. This kind of material is inherently unstable, especially when you start removing it and creating voids underneath. The students worked for hours, taking turns crawling into their makeshift tunnel and scooping out handfuls of dirt with their bare hands. As the night wore on, they managed to tunnel about 15 feet, 4.5 meters, through the sealed entrance. 15 feet might not sound like much, but when you're digging a tunnel just wide enough for a person to crawl through, that represents hours of exhausting work. They were getting close to breaking through to the actual cave system beyond the fill. The progress was slow and dangerous, but the students were probably getting excited as they got deeper into their tunnel. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't have known without proper training or experience, was that every handful of dirt they removed was making their tunnel more unstable. The loose fill material above them was being held up by nothing more than the material they were digging out below, and eventually, basic physics was going to take over. At around midnight, after hours of digging, the inevitable happened. The fill material above their tunnel collapsed. The collapse was sudden and catastrophic. One moment, Thomas Johnson was inside the tunnel working to remove more dirt. And the next moment, tons of earth and debris came crashing down on top of him. The weight was enormous. We're talking about the equivalent of several dump truck loads of dirt, rocks, and debris falling on a single person. The 3 other students who were just inside the tunnel entrance were lucky enough to be far enough back that they weren't completely buried, but they were still caught in the collapse zone. They found themselves trapped in a partially collapsed tunnel with their friend Thomas, somewhere under tons of earth ahead of them. The 5th student, who had been outside the entrance when the collapse occurred, was the only one who remained completely free and able to help. But he was also the only witness to what had just happened, watching his friends disappear under a mountain of falling earth in a matter of seconds. The panic that set in was immediate and overwhelming. The students who were partially trapped in the tunnel were screaming for Thomas, trying to dig toward where they thought he might be buried, but they were working with their bare hands against tons of unstable material. Every movement they made could potentially trigger another collapse that would bury them as well. The student who was outside immediately understood that this was far beyond anything they could handle themselves. He ran to get help, probably running faster than he'd ever run in his life, knowing that his friend was buried alive somewhere under all that dirt and that every second counted. When emergency services received the call about a cave-in with people trapped, they immediately dispatched rescue teams to the scene. But even as the rescuers were racing to the location, everyone involved probably knew that the situation was desperate. Being buried under tons of dirt and debris doesn't leave much margin for survival. Professional rescue workers arrived at the scene with proper equipment and began the dangerous work of trying to locate Thomas Johnson and dig him out of the collapsed tunnel. But they had to work carefully. One wrong move could trigger another collapse that would bury the rescuers as well. The other 3 students who had been partially trapped in the tunnel were extracted relatively quickly, but they were in shock and couldn't provide much useful information about exactly where Thomas had been when the collapse occurred. The rescue workers had to essentially guess at his location and begin the painstaking process of removing dirt and debris. Working in the dark, in cramped conditions, with unstable material all around them, the rescue team began digging. They knew they were racing against time. If Thomas was still alive under all that earth, he had a very limited air supply and was probably suffering from compression injuries from the weight pressing down on him. The psychological pressure on everyone involved was enormous. Thomas's friends were watching helplessly as rescuers tried to find their buried friend, knowing that they were the ones who had talked him into this ill-advised adventure. The rescue workers were putting their own lives at risk, trying to save someone who might already be dead. At approximately 1:30 a.m., about an hour and a half after the collapse, the rescue workers finally located Thomas Johnson's body. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The weight and pressure of the collapsed material had been too much for him to survive, and he had likely died very quickly after the cave-in occurred. The recovery of Thomas's body was a heartbreaking end to what had started as a group of friends looking for a late-night adventure. The other 4 students were left to deal with the trauma of watching their friend die in a completely preventable accident, while Thomas's family had to cope with the loss of their 20-year-old son, who had died trying to access a cave that had been deliberately sealed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. The cave had been sealed for good reasons, probably because it was unstable, dangerous, or had been the site of previous accidents. The authorities who made the decision to fill the entrance 8 years earlier had been trying to prevent exactly the kind of tragedy that ultimately claimed Thomas's life. Days later, the cave was sealed again, this time forever. On January 10th, 1990, 3 people entered a lava cave in Hawaii for what should have been a relaxing experience in nature's own sauna. But when one member of the group became separated, things went from bad to worse, to unimaginable. The lava cave near Route 137 in Opihikau, Hawaii's Puna district, had earned a reputation among locals as nature's own underground spa. This wasn't your typical tourist cave. It was a natural sauna with hot water pools and temperatures that reached 96 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius. Formed by ancient volcanic activity when molten lava carved out a complex network of tunnels and chambers. On this particular Wednesday in January, 3 people decided to experience this natural wonder. Rodney Armour was 55 years old and visiting the area with his wife Jo as part of a retreat. They had brought along Mauve Fisher, probably a friend who knew about the cave's reputation as a natural sauna. The 3 arrived at the cave entrance, located in a natural sink that dropped 11 feet, 3.3 meters, from ground level. What they found at the bottom was the entrance to what locals called the Center of the Earth Cave, a name that would prove ominously appropriate. The cave's entrance was immediately challenging, an initial descending tube just barely big enough for a person's body to squeeze through. You had to crawl through a tunnel with rock pressing in from all sides, which could be incredibly intimidating. Once through that initial constriction, the cave opened up significantly. The narrow tube led to a stoopway where you could crouch while walking, then continued descending and enlarging into a walkway where people could stand upright. The cave system was extensive, described as being as large as a city block, with numerous small side passages branching off from the main routes, creating a maze-like environment. The heat was intense and constant at 96 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius, with high humidity from hot water pools scattered throughout. For people seeking a sauna experience, this was perfect, but for anyone unprepared for such conditions, it could quickly become dangerous. Rodney, Jo, and Mauve began exploring the cave system using only flashlights with no specialized caving equipment, no ropes, helmets, backup lighting, or communication devices. This wasn't unusual for casual visitors to what was known locally as a relatively safe recreational spot. As the 3 moved through the hot, humid passages, something went wrong. At some point during their exploration, Rodney Armour became separated from his wife and Mauve Fisher. In a cave system as large as a city block, with numerous side passages, It would have been easy for someone to take a wrong turn or lose track of their companions in the maze-like environment. For Rodney, who was 55 and probably not in peak physical condition, being alone in the intensely hot environment would have been immediately stressful. But what happened next shows how panic can make people make decisions that defy all logic. Instead of staying put and calling out for his companions, or trying to retrace his steps back to where he last remembered being with them, Rodney began making increasingly desperate choices. In his panicked state, Rodney started moving deeper into the cave system, taking passages that led further away from the main routes. He was no longer thinking logically about navigation or safety. He was just desperately searching for any opening that might lead to an exit. Each turn seemed to promise escape, yet each turn only pushed him closer to disaster. The passages Rodney chose to explore were getting narrower and more restrictive. Instead of recognizing this as a warning sign that he was moving away from the main cave system, his panic-driven mind convinced him that these tight spaces might be shortcuts to the surface. Eventually, Rodney found himself approaching a particularly narrow constriction, a tube that angled downward diagonally into the rock. This was exactly the kind of passage that experienced cave explorers would avoid, especially when alone and without proper equipment. It was clearly leading deeper into the cave system, not toward any exit. Yet to Rodney's panicked eyes, it resembled a final chance at freedom. The thought of staying still was unbearable, so he plunged onward. But Rodney's rational thinking had been completely overtaken by panic and heat stress. He began squeezing himself into the constriction. As Rodney wedged himself into the diagonal tube, he quickly realized he had made a terrible mistake. The passage was barely wide enough for his body, with solid rock pressing against him from all sides. He couldn't turn around, couldn't back out easily, and couldn't move forward. He was effectively trapped in a stone coffin, angled downward in the suffocating heat. Helplessness spread like fire through his chest as reality sank in. The psychological impact of being wedged in this position was catastrophic. Panic set in completely. Rodney's breathing became rapid and shallow. His heart rate skyrocketed, and he began experiencing the full-blown panic attack that could ultimately kill him. He was hyperventilating in the hot, humid air. His body was overheating in the enclosed space, and his mind was consumed with the terror of being buried alive in the rock. His anxiety peaked to levels. Meanwhile, Joe and Mauve had realized Rodney was missing. They called out for him and searched the immediate area, but in a cave with numerous branching passages and constant echoes, their voices probably never reached him in his distant, narrow prison. After searching as long as they dared in the dangerous heat, Joe and Mauve made the difficult decision to exit the cave and call for help. They squeezed back through the body-size constriction and climbed out of the 11-foot sink. At 2:30 p.m., they reported Rodney missing. Their hearts must have been heavy, torn between fear and regret. The rescue operation was both urgent and incredibly challenging. Professional rescue teams knew they were dealing with a missing person in an environment where heat alone could be fatal. The intense heat made it impossible for rescuers to work for extended periods, so they organized their search in 20-minute shifts, rotating team members to prevent heat exhaustion. Their efficiency and training became a race against time itself. The rescue teams began systematically searching the cave system, following proper protocols and checking every passage and chamber. They were experienced in underground rescue operations, but even they were being pushed to their limits by the extreme heat and humidity. Sweat poured, muscles strained, but they pressed on with determination. When the rescuers finally found Rodney, the scene was both tragic and telling. He was wedged deep in the narrow diagonal passage, exactly where his panic-driven decisions had led him. His body was positioned head down in the constriction, trapped in the stone tube that had become his tomb. The hopeless silence of the rock confirmed his fate. It was immediately clear that Rodney had died from cardiac arrest. The combination of extreme heat, physical exertion, psychological terror, and the panic attack had overwhelmed his cardiovascular system. His heart had simply given out under the enormous stress of his situation. He was gone before help could reach him, sealed in the dark. The narrow passage where Rodney died told the story of his final moments. He had made a series of increasingly desperate and irrational decisions, driven by panic rather than logic, that led him deeper into danger rather than towards safety. The diagonal tube he had wedged himself into was clearly not an exit route. It was a dead-end passage that led nowhere but deeper into the rock. His final choice defined the outcome. The recovery operation was almost as challenging as the search. Rescue teams had to remove Rodney's body from the narrow diagonal passage while working in extreme heat. By 4:15 p.m., less than 2 hours after the initial report, they had successfully removed his body from the cave. Exhausted rescuers carried him out, burdened by both weight and sorrow. The medical findings suggest Rodney's death resulted from multiple factors. For a 55-year-old man who may not have been in peak condition, this combination of heat stress, physical exertion, and psychological panic created the perfect storm for a cardiac emergency. It was a tragic reminder that the human body has limits, and panic can push those limits to breaking. The physical demands of caving, especially in extreme environments like the heated lava cave, should not be underestimated. Even a recreational cave experience can put significant stress on the human body, and people with underlying health conditions need to be aware of these risks. During the summer of 1990, a group of cave explorers spent hours surveying a cave system in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. The cave system on the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains was a complex network of passages, chambers, and underground streams. The group had spent a long session underground, working their way through various sections of the cave system with their surveying equipment. By the time they decided to head for the entrance, they were physically exhausted from hours of crawling, climbing, and working in the confined underground environment. The exit route took them to a point where an underground stream descended to a lower level of the cave system. Rather than following the water down, the group proceeded along a narrow canyon passage that ran parallel to the stream's descent. This passage was typical of many cave corridors, narrow walls on either side, with what appeared to be a solid rock floor beneath their feet. Derek Hoyle was the last one in the line, as the group made their way through the narrow canyon passage. As Derek walked along the passage, he noticed something unusual about the floor ahead. There was a section where the surface appeared lower than the rest, like a bump or dip in a road, where the ground dropped slightly before rising again. The entire floor in this section looked somewhat fragile at first glance, with what appeared to be loose rock and debris, but it also seemed solid enough, the kind of surface that others walk on without incident. What Derek and the rest of the group didn't realize was that they were looking at a death trap. The floor in this section wasn't bedrock at all. It was a thin layer of debris and rock fragments that had collected over a vertical crevice, a crack in the cave floor that dropped straight down to the stream 35 feet, 10.6 meters below. As Derek stepped forward into the depressed area, putting his full weight on what he thought was solid ground, the inevitable happened. Without any warning whatsoever, no cracking sound, no shifting sensation, no indication that anything was wrong, the floor completely disappeared beneath his feet. The thin layer of rock and debris that had been spanning the vertical crevice gave way all at once, and Derek suddenly found himself falling into a pitch-black void. In that split second of absolute terror, as his body dropped through the collapsing floor, Derek's survival instincts kicked in, and he threw his arms out desperately, trying to catch himself on anything solid. But Derek didn't catch himself with his arms. Instead, his neck caught on the edges of the crevice opening as his body plummeted through the hole. The impact was immediate and brutal. Derek's neck slammed into the rocky edges of the crevice opening, and suddenly, his entire body weight, probably around 170 to 200 pounds, was being supported by his neck alone. A throbbing sensation went through his entire spine. Like literally, he felt it instantly. He was suspended in the vertical shaft by his neck, with his body hanging in the empty void below and nothing but air between him and the stream 35 feet down. The pain was excruciating. The pressure on his neck was enormous, compressing his throat. Derek could feel his neck vertebrae being compressed under his body weight, and he knew instinctively that if this pressure continued for more than a few seconds, his neck could break and he would die. But the situation got even worse in the next instant. The collapse of the floor had triggered a chain reaction. Rocks and debris from both sides of the crevice started falling inward, tumbling down into the vertical shaft where Derek was trapped. As the rocks fell, they wedged around Derek's neck, piling up against his trapped head and shoulders. He was being strangled and crushed simultaneously, suspended by his neck in a vertical shaft, with rocks raining down on him. And he had maybe seconds before his neck broke and he died. In a moment of desperate clarity, fueled by pure survival instinct, Derek threw his arms outward against the walls of the vertical crevice. The shaft was narrow enough that he could reach both walls, and he pressed his arms and hands against the rough rock surfaces with every ounce of strength he possessed. Using a technique that rock climbers call chimneying, bracing your body between two opposing walls, Derek managed to create enough outward pressure with his arms to support his body weight. By pushing hard against both walls of the narrow crevice, he was able to take the crushing pressure off his neck and transfer his weight to his arms instead. The relief on his neck was immediate, but the position Derek now found himself in was barely sustainable. But then suddenly, he could feel his neck slowly loosening up. The crevice walls, destabilized by his movements, started collapsing again. More debris cascaded down from above, rocks and fragments pouring into the shaft like a deadly waterfall. The weight and force of the falling debris pushed Derek downward, forcing him deeper into the vertical shaft. Derek kept slipping further down, with only his desperate arm pressure preventing a fatal 35-foot plunge. He frantically tried to reposition his legs, searching for any outcropping to push against with his feet or knees. But the walls were too smooth or covered in loose debris. His legs flailed uselessly in the darkness, unable to find anything solid. Then a large piece of debris slammed into his shoulder. For a split second, he lost his grip. His arms slipped against the walls, and he dropped several more feet before managing to slam his arms back out and stop his fall. Derek was now 15 feet, 4.5 meters, deep inside the vertical shaft, twice as far from rescue, and that much closer to the stream below. Derek knew he couldn't maintain this position indefinitely. His arms were already beginning to shake from the constant strain, and once his muscles gave out completely, he would fall. The question wasn't if he would fall, but when, and whether help would arrive before his strength failed. The other spelunkers, who had been walking ahead of Derek in the passage, heard the catastrophic collapse behind them. When they reached the location where Derek had been walking moments before, they found a gaping hole in the cave floor where solid ground should have been. They approached the edge carefully, testing each step to make sure the remaining floor was stable. When they shined their lights down into the crevice, they could see Derek about 15 feet below them, wedged in the narrow shaft with his arms pressed against the walls in a desperate chimney position. Derek looked up at his companions, and they could see the exhaustion and pain etched on his face. His arms were visibly shaking from the strain of supporting his weight, and it was clear he couldn't hold this position much longer. The group immediately understood that they had minutes at most to execute a rescue before Derek's strength gave out, and he fell to his death. The group quickly began organizing their rescue operation. They retrieved rope from their equipment and started preparing to lower it down to Derek. The opening of the crevice was partially blocked by debris from the collapse, and they had to work carefully to maneuver the rope through the rubble and position it where Derek could reach it. When they finally got the rope down to where Derek could grab it, they told him to tie it around his torso. But Derek faced an impossible challenge. His arms were the only thing keeping him from falling 35 feet to the rocks below. If he released pressure with even one arm to work with the rope, he risked losing his chimney position entirely and plummeting into the darkness. Derek's arms were shaking violently now, the muscles pushed far beyond their normal limits. Every second that passed brought him closer to complete muscle failure, but he knew he had no choice. He quickly released pressure from both arms and grabbed onto the rope, as it was now his only way out. His plummeted down a few inches, but was able to have a good grip on it. Somehow, through a combination of desperation, determination, and sheer willpower, Derek managed to loop the rope around his torso and secure it with a basic knot. The entire process took several minutes that felt like hours, and by the time he finished, his arms were on the verge of complete failure. The others above called down to Derek, telling him to try climbing up the rope while they pulled from above. But Derek was utterly exhausted. He tried to pull himself up, but his muscles simply wouldn't respond. The pain in his legs from the pressure and lack of circulation was excruciating. He looked up at his companions and shook his head. He couldn't climb. They would have to pull him up. The group understood immediately. They positioned themselves around the crevice opening, bracing their feet and getting secure handholds. On a coordinated count, they began pulling Derek up through the narrow vertical shaft. It was brutal work. Derek was essentially dead weight at this point, unable to assist in his own rescue. The others had to haul him up through an irregular shaft filled with loose debris, watching for falling rocks that could injure Derek or themselves. As Derek ascended through the shaft, his body scraped against the sharp rock walls, adding new cuts and abrasions to his existing injuries. The group could hear him groaning in pain as his body scraped against the walls, but they couldn't slow down. After several minutes of intense effort, Derek's head appeared at the edge of the crevice. The team redoubled their pulling, and with a final coordinated heave, Derek was hauled up and over the edge of the opening, landing on the solid cave floor beside the deadly hole that had nearly claimed his life. Against all odds, Derek had survived a situation that should have killed him. The group gave Derek time to recover while they secured the area around the collapsed floor section. Before exiting the cave, they marked the dangerous crevice with clear warnings to alert any future cave explorers who might use this passage about the deadly trap waiting beneath what appeared to be solid ground. July 15th, 1995. The morning sun beat down on the Florida landscape as two experienced cave divers prepared for what should have been a routine technical dive into Thunderhole Cave. Robert McGuire and Del Motes had planned this dive meticulously over the previous weeks, studying maps of the underwater cave system and calculating their gas requirements with precision. The dive plan called for mixed gas diving, a sophisticated technique that uses different nitrogen and oxygen mixtures at various depths to extend bottom time and reduce decompression requirements. Two separate breathing mixtures had been prepared with laboratory precision. A standard nitrox blend for the deeper portions of the dive, and a 50-50 mix, 50% oxygen and 50% nitrogen, intended exclusively for shallower depths during the decompression phase. The tanks were labeled with their gas contents clearly marked on white tape wrapped around each cylinder. McGuire had taken several Sudafed tablets before arriving at the dive site that morning. His sinuses had been bothering him for days, and the decongestant was meant to help him equalize pressure during descent, a common practice among divers dealing with congestion. The water at Thunderhole's entrance was cool and inviting. The cave system was well known among Florida's technical diving community, a challenging environment that demanded respect, proper procedures, and unwavering attention to detail. McGuire and Motes entered the water together shortly after 10 in the morning. The descent began smoothly through crystal clear water. The divers dropped through the water column at a controlled rate. Visibility was excellent that day, perhaps 100 feet or more, and the familiar formations guided them deeper into the system. At 70 feet, approximately 21 meters below the surface, they reached their first planned waypoint. The cave passage opened into a larger room here, a natural gathering point that many divers used as a staging area. This was where McGuire should have switched to his deeper mix and secured the 50-50 tank at this depth for later use during decompression. The 50-50 mixture with its high oxygen content was perfect for shallow stops between 20 and 70 feet, where it would accelerate nitrogen elimination from body tissues without creating oxygen toxicity. Standard procedure called for leaving this tank here, marked with a light or line, ready for pickup on the return journey. But somehow, in the routine of the dive and the distraction of the stunning cave environment, the switch never happened correctly. Perhaps McGuire became disoriented in the moment, or maybe the Sudafed was affecting his mental clarity more than he realized. Whatever the reason, he continued his descent with the wrong tank, carrying the 50-50 mix deeper into the cave system, while the appropriate deeper mixture, the one designed for high-pressure depths, remained clipped to his harness, unused or perhaps left behind at 70 feet, waiting uselessly for a diver who had already passed it by. Moats, swimming nearby in the crystal-clear water, had no reason to question his partner's gas management. Each diver was responsible for their own gas selection and switching procedures. The buddy system in technical diving assumes that each diver maintains their own protocols while providing backup for emergencies. There was no way for Moats to know that McGuire was breathing the wrong mixture as they descended together into the depths. They continued downward through increasingly narrow passages. The cave walls closed in around them as they followed the natural contours of the limestone. The pressure increased steadily with every meter of descent, squeezing their wetsuits tighter against their bodies and compressing the air in their tanks. At 140 feet, nearly 43 meters below the surface, they reached their planned maximum depth. The cave passage here was spectacular, a tunnel carved by ancient underground rivers that had long since vanished. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the pressure at this depth was approximately 5.3 atmospheres, more than 5 times the pressure at sea level. Every gas breathed at this depth was compressed to that same pressure, including the oxygen molecules flowing into McGuire's lungs with each breath. His regulator delivered the 50-50 mix smoothly, the breathing resistance normal for this depth. Nothing felt wrong. There was no warning sign, no unusual sensation to alert him that every breath was bringing him closer to disaster. The 50-50 mix that was safe and even beneficial at 70 feet had become a deadly poison at 140 feet. The partial pressure of oxygen in his breathing gas had climbed far beyond safe limits, reaching levels that would cause oxygen toxicity, a condition where oxygen itself becomes toxic to the human central nervous system. That's because at 70 feet, the oxygen partial pressure in the 50-50 mix was manageable, approximately 1.6 atmospheres, right at the edge of accepted limits for technical diving. But at 140 feet, that same mixture created an oxygen partial pressure exceeding 2.6 atmospheres, well into the danger zone, where oxygen attacks the brain and nervous system like a poison. Oxygen toxicity is one of diving's most insidious dangers. The body's tissues, particularly the brain and nervous system, react violently to excessive oxygen pressure. Brain cells begin firing erratically, overwhelmed by the chemical imbalance. There are rarely any warning signs, no gradual onset of symptoms, no tingling or strange sensations, no time to recognize the danger and respond appropriately. McGuire and Moats spent approximately 15 minutes at maximum depth, exploring the passage and checking their dive computers regularly. Everything seemed normal. Both divers' lights played across the cave walls as they made mental notes of the features they would report to other divers later. Then they began the long ascent. This was when the dive plan called for careful decompression stops at various depths, allowing dissolved nitrogen to safely leave their tissues without forming dangerous bubbles in their bloodstream. The ascent proceeded according to plan initially, both divers rising slowly through the water column while controlling their buoyancy precisely. They rose through the water, making their required stops at predetermined depths. At each stop, they hovered motionless in the water for the calculated time, watching their dive computers count down the minutes. As they approached shallower depths, the oxygen partial pressure in McGuire's breathing gas was decreasing as the surrounding pressure decreased, but the damage may have already been done during the time at maximum depth. They were somewhere around 70 feet, perhaps beginning their decompression sequence, when everything went catastrophically wrong. Without any warning whatsoever, McGuire's body went completely rigid in the water. His regulator fell from his mouth as violent convulsions seized his entire frame. His arms jerked wildly in uncontrolled spasms, his legs kicked in random directions, and bubbles exploded from his mouth as water rushed in to fill his lungs. The oxygen toxicity had triggered a grand mal seizure, the most feared and most deadly consequence of breathing too much oxygen under pressure. Moats spun around at the sudden commotion, his light catching his friend's convulsing body. Horror and disbelief flooded through him as he watched Maguire thrashing uncontrollably in the water. He lunged forward immediately, reaching for his friend, trying desperately to stabilize him and get the regulator back into his mouth. But oxygen toxicity seizures are nearly impossible to manage underwater. The violent convulsions made it impossible for Maguire to hold anything, including his regulator. His jaw was clenched tight, then slack, then clenching again in rapid succession. Water flooded into Maguire's lungs with each involuntary gasp. His body was completely beyond his control, every muscle firing at random as his nervous system short-circuited under the toxic effects of too much oxygen. Moats struggled desperately, fighting against his friend's thrashing limbs, trying to force the regulator back in, trying somehow to reverse what was happening before his eyes. But some things cannot be stopped once they begin. The convulsions continued for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute. Maguire's movements gradually weakened as his lungs filled with water and oxygen deprivation claimed his brain. Moats held his friend's body, still trying futilely to help, even as he knew it was already too late. The thrashing stopped. Maguire went limp in the water, his body now just dead weight in Moats' arms. There were no other divers present in the cave system that day. No one waited on the surface providing backup support or monitoring dive times. The two men had entered Thunderhole alone, following a practice that was common but always risky. Now, Moats faced the nightmare scenario every dive buddy fears. His partner was dead, and he was alone at depth with his own decompression obligations still unfulfilled. Moats had to make an impossible choice. He could not bring Maguire's body up immediately without risking his own life to decompression sickness. He secured his friend's body as best he could and completed his own decompression stops, each minute an agony of grief and shock. When he finally surfaced hours later, alone and devastated, the full weight of what had happened crashed down on him. His friend had died from a simple mistake. The wrong tank at the wrong depth. The 50-50 mix that should have been left at 70 feet had traveled to 140 feet, and the oxygen that gives life had become the poison that took it. The unmarked depth limits, the Sudafed tablets, the moment of confusion that led to the fatal gas selection. All of it combined into a tragedy that could never be undone. On November the 17th, 1979, what started as a routine caving trip to an easy West Virginia cave turned into an absolute nightmare when an inexperienced group with a dangerously overconfident leader were putting their lives on the line. Whiting's Neck Cave sits in the Panhandle area of West Virginia, and by 1979, it had earned a solid reputation among explorers as an easy, beginner-friendly cave system. On this particular November day, 4 experienced spelunkers from the Baltimore Grotto arrived at Whiting's Neck Cave. Richard Treater, George Nichols, Mike Lurs, and Steve Jensen were all seasoned cave explorers who knew proper techniques and safety protocols. They had brought along 4 novices who were getting their first real caving experience, and they were planning a conservative trip through the easier sections of the cave. The group entered through the back entrance and made their way to the main feature of the cave, a 45-foot, 13.7 meter, inclined drop that required proper rope work to descend safely. The Baltimore Grotto members rigged a hand line on the left side of the drop. All 8 members of their group went down without incident, exactly as planned for a beginner-friendly trip. But then, a second group arrived at the top of the drop, and things immediately started to go wrong. This second group was led by someone Steve Jensen would later describe as a military type A personality. Someone who seemed knowledgeable about caving and rock climbing, who projected confidence and authority, and who apparently convinced about 15 people in their late teens to follow him into the cave. Of these 15 young people, 2 were deaf, which added another layer of communication difficulty to an already problematic situation. Before this second group could even get organized, a third group arrived at the drop. The entrance area was now becoming crowded with explorers of wildly varying experience levels, and the potential for chaos was building rapidly. The leader of the second group took one look at the handline the Baltimore Grotto had rigged on the left side, and apparently decided it wasn't good enough for his group. Instead of using the safe, conservative setup that experienced ones had installed, he rigged his own line right in the middle of the drop, directly over the section where there was a 10-foot, 3-meter section of completely free vertical drop, followed by 35 feet, 10.6 meters, of steep descent at about an 80-degree angle. The Baltimore Grotto members offered to let the second group use their handline, twice. They explained that their setup was safer and more appropriate for inexperienced groups. But the military-type leader refused both times, apparently convinced that his way was better. Then the real disaster began. Members of the second group started body rappelling down the drop using the poorly positioned rope their leader had rigged. Body rappelling is a technique where you wrap the rope around your body to create friction and control your descent, but it requires practice, proper technique, and ideally should be done on appropriate terrain. Using it on a drop with a 10-foot free fall section and a steep 80-degree slope below was asking for trouble, especially with inexperienced teenagers. Steve Jensen and the other Baltimore Grotto members watched in growing horror as it became immediately obvious that the members of the second group had no idea what they were doing. Their inexperience wasn't just apparent, it was glaringly dangerous. Jensen yelled down to Mike Lurs, who had gone ahead into the next section, to get Richard Treater. They needed the most experienced members of their group present because this situation was deteriorating fast, and someone was going to get seriously hurt or killed. In the next few minutes, the situation went from bad to catastrophic. One deaf girl fell 20 feet, 6 meters, down the drop, tumbling and bouncing off the rock face before landing hard at the bottom. Miraculously, she wasn't seriously injured, but she became briefly hysterical from the trauma and terror of the fall. Before anyone could properly respond to that incident, another person fell, this time dropping 10 feet, 3 meters, before hitting the slope. Again, through sheer luck, there were no serious injuries, but the person was shaken and panicked. But the accidents didn't stop there. 2 other members of the inexperienced group had made it partway down the poorly rigged rope before they became completely stranded. They had descended to a point where they couldn't safely continue down, but they also couldn't climb back up. They were stuck on the steep slope, clinging to the rope in the middle of the drop, terrified and unable to move in either direction. The Baltimore Grotto members watched this unfolding disaster with a mixture of horror and anger. This military-type leader had refused their help, ignored their safer rope setup, and was now directly responsible for multiple falls and people stranded on a dangerous drop. And there were still more people from his group waiting at the top to attempt the same descent. The experienced guys made a decision. Things had gone far enough. Someone was going to die if they didn't intervene immediately and forcefully. Steve Jensen and his companions confronted the leader of the second group and gave him a direct order. Leave the cave now and take your group with you. This wasn't a suggestion or a polite request. It was a command backed by the authority that comes from actually knowing what you're doing in a dangerous environment. But first, they had to deal with the immediate crisis. 2 young people were stranded on the rope, unable to move, and more members of the group were scattered at various points below the drop, some injured and all traumatized by what they had just experienced. The Baltimore Grotto members organized a proper rescue operation. They worked systematically to get everyone who had made it to the bottom of the drop stabilized and accounted for. Then they turned their attention to the 2 people stranded on the rope in the middle of the drop. Getting these 2 down safely wasn't a matter of talking them through proper technique or giving them instructions. They were too panicked, too inexperienced, and in too precarious a position for that to work. The experienced ones had to resort to brute force, literally hauling them up by the rope using pure muscle power. This was exhausting, dangerous work. They had to pull the stranded individuals up a steep, irregular slope while making sure they didn't lose control of the rope or cause additional injuries. But through careful coordination and significant physical effort, they managed to get both stranded people back to the top of the drop. Once everyone was accounted for and the immediate danger was resolved, the Baltimore Grotto members made sure the inexperienced group, and especially their overconfident leader, understood that they were done. They were exiting the cave immediately, and they were not to attempt any more rope work or exploration. The entire group made their way out of Whiting's Neck Cave, with the experienced ones essentially shepherding the inexperienced group to ensure no one else got hurt. The military-type leader was probably embarrassed and angry at being overruled, while the teenagers he'd brought were traumatized and shaken by the falls and chaos they had experienced. Steve Jensen and the Baltimore Grotto members believed they had lived up to their responsibilities by intervening when they did. They violated the inexperienced leader's autonomy and freedom to run his own trip, but they potentially saved lives by doing so. The novices in that group, at least most of them, probably didn't fully understand what they were getting into when they followed this overconfident leader into the cave. June 15th, 2002. The Florida sun beat down on the entrance to Bat-Colon Cave as 26-year-old Mark Orr adjusted his diving mask. He and 3 friends had traveled to Florida's Panhandle region, specifically to explore underwater caves. The crystal-clear springs and extensive cave systems were legendary among divers. But Mark and his friends were making a fatal mistake. All 4 divers were certified open-water divers. They had completed basic scuba training and were comfortable diving in oceans, lakes, and quarries. But cave diving is an entirely different world, one that requires specialized training, equipment, and certification. Cave diving statistics are terrifying. Since 1960, nearly 500 divers had been reported missing in underwater caves across Florida, Mexico, and the Caribbean. Of those 500, only 3 had ever been found alive till this incident. The group stood at the cave entrance, excited and completely unaware of the danger they were about to face. They had basic scuba gear, tanks, regulators, masks, and fins. What they didn't have was cave diving equipment like redundant air systems, specialized lights, and proper guideline reels. They did bring one rope to use as a guideline, a single cord they planned to follow back to the entrance. In proper cave diving, this guideline is sacred. It's the umbilical cord connecting divers to the surface and survival. Losing it means almost certain death. The water at the cave entrance was impossibly clear. Visibility extended for dozens of feet, several meters, making the underwater world seem safe and inviting. The limestone formations created a cathedral-like space filled with shafts of sunlight. Mark took a deep breath and descended into the water. The first few minutes were magical. The cave opened into a large chamber with stunning rock formations. The temperature was a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees Celsius, kept constant by the natural spring system. But as the 4 divers moved deeper into the cave, the environment began to change. The passages became narrower. The natural light from the entrance faded to black. Now, they were completely dependent on their flashlights to see. That's when disaster struck. In cave diving, the greatest danger isn't running out of air or equipment failure. It's something far simpler and far more terrifying: silt. The floor of underwater caves is covered with fine sediment that has accumulated over thousands of years. This silt is so fine that it can remain suspended in water for hours. When disturbed by divers' fins or movements, it creates what cave divers call a silt out, a condition where visibility drops to 0 in seconds. One of the divers accidentally kicked the cave floor. A cloud of silt exploded upward like an underwater dust storm. Within seconds, the crystal-clear water turned into a brown soup, where visibility was measured in inches rather than feet. Panic set in immediately. Mark couldn't see his hand in front of his face. He couldn't see his fellow divers. Most critically, he couldn't see the rope guideline that was supposed to lead them back to safety. In 0 visibility, underwater, deep inside a cave system, disorientation is instantaneous. Up feels like down, left feels like right. The human brain simply isn't designed to function without visual reference points. Mark reached out blindly, trying to find the rope or his diving partners. His hands found only rock walls and water. His air consumption skyrocketed as panic drove his breathing rate higher and higher. Cave diving training teaches specific protocols for silt outs. Divers are trained to remain calm, feel for the guideline, and follow it back to safety using touch alone. But Mark had no such training. He was operating on instinct and fear. He swam blindly through the darkness, burning through his air supply at an alarming rate. His tank gauge was dropping rapidly. In normal diving conditions, a tank might last 45 to 60 minutes. In panic conditions, that same tank could be empty in 15 minutes. Mark's gloved hands scraped against limestone walls as he searched desperately for the way out. Every passage felt identical in the darkness. He had no idea if he was swimming deeper into the cave system or toward the entrance. Then he remembered something. Earlier in the dive, before the silt out, they had passed through a large chamber with an air pocket at the top, a place where the cave ceiling rose above the water level, creating a breathing space. With his air gauge approaching zero, Mark made a desperate gamble. He stopped swimming horizontally and instead kicked upward, hoping to find that air pocket. His head broke the surface just as his regulator delivered its last breath of compressed air. Mark gasped in the cave air, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. He was alive, but his situation was still desperate. He used his failing flashlight to survey his surroundings. He was in an air pocket roughly 10 feet, 3 meters wide, with a small ledge above the waterline. Mark hauled himself onto the ledge, his muscles shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. His diving equipment felt impossibly heavy. The cave air was humid and stale, but it was breathable. Now came the worst part, the waiting. Mark had no idea if his fellow divers had made it out. He didn't know if anyone above ground even knew there was a problem. He was alone in absolute darkness deep inside an underwater cave with no air supply and no way to signal for help. The silence was overwhelming. In the ocean, there are always sounds, waves, marine life, the constant background noise of water movement. But in the cave air pocket, there was nothing. Just Mark's breathing and the occasional drip of water. He prayed. What else could he do? He asked for rescue, for forgiveness for his stupidity, for another chance. Then, exhausted from the ordeal, Mark fell asleep leaning on the cold limestone ledge, half submerged in water. Above ground, Mark's diving partners had managed to escape the cave. They emerged confused and panicked, realizing that Mark was still missing somewhere in the underwater system. They immediately called for help. The call went out to Scott Hunsucker, a certified cave diving instructor with years of experience in Florida's treacherous underwater caves. When Hunsucker received the call about a missing diver in Bat Colon Cave, he prepared for a body recovery mission. The statistics were clear. When untrained divers go missing in underwater caves, they don't come back alive. Hunsucker had participated in dozens of these recoveries over the years. It was always the same story. Overconfident divers with inadequate training making fatal mistakes. 6 hours after Mark had entered the cave, Hunsucker descended into the water, fully expecting to find a corpse. He navigated the cave system with the casual expertise of someone who had made hundreds of cave dives. He carried redundant air systems, multiple powerful lights, and proper guidelines. He knew exactly where to search based on the description Mark's partners had provided. When Hunsucker reached the large chamber with the air pocket, he surfaced cautiously, his light cutting through the darkness. And there was Mark Orr, alive, leaning on a ledge in his dive gear. For a moment, both men stared at each other in disbelief. Hunsucker had been certain he was recovering a body. Mark had been certain he was going to die in that cave. After a brief greeting and a quick assessment of Mark's condition, Hunsucker gave him a spare regulator connected to his redundant air system. Then, using proper cave diving techniques and following a guideline, Hunsucker led Mark out of the cave system. They emerged into Florida sunshine to the cheers of emergency responders who had gathered at the cave entrance. Mark was exhausted, hypothermic, and traumatized, but alive. The rescue made international news. Mark Orr became only the 4th person in over 40 years to be rescued alive from an underwater cave after being reported missing. Out of nearly 500 missing divers since 1960, only 4 had survived. The odds had been 496 to 4 against him. Mark's survival came down to a combination of luck and a single decision. The luck was finding that air pocket before his tank ran empty. The decision was to stay put and wait for rescue rather than attempting to swim out in zero visibility with no air supply. The incident became a cautionary tale in the cave diving community, It demonstrated why cave diving certification exists and why the rules are so strict. Those rules aren't meant to limit fun. They're written in the blood of the 496 divers who didn't make it out. Mark Orr had entered Cave as an overconfident recreational diver. He emerged as living proof of why proper training and respect for the underwater environment aren't optional. They're the difference between life and death.